Thanks to King and Wood Mallesons. And Jacquelynne, our chair, is going to introduce our speaker. Jacquelynne.
Thank you, everybody. And yes, thank you, King and Wood Mallesons, for this very fine room and that you always allow us to have, and we're very, very grateful for your support. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Senator Jacinta, pardon me. Now, I've been practicing your name all day and I know that I'm going to stuff it, so I think I won't insult you, I'll just say Senator Jacinta Price. I spent the weekend reading this book, which I absolutely recommend to you all. It's, as they say, a riveting read, but it's also deeply shocking and provoking, as it is uplifting and also sorrowful. Now, last month, you'll all recall that the Senator was made a Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency, and this is alongside her existing position as Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians. And I think, Senator, we're all looking forward to seeing how that nexus actually evolves. Now, many of you will know that the Senator was elected to the Senate in 2022, just 3 years ago, as a CLP Senator for the representing the Northern Territory. But I hope tonight that she'll touch on more than just that period, because she has this most interesting life, including as a rock star, believe it, outside the Parliament, and a high-profile children's television presenter. Unfortunately, it was that last position, the children's television presenter, that was used so awfully against her by an Indigenous leader as a point of ridicule. And so she probably will talk a bit more about that. Senator Price is also known to many people here for her high profile and successful lead of the No case in the recent Voice referenda. And now, whilst that was a formidable campaign, it really is only a hint of the woman that she has become and the child that she was. Senator Price calls herself exactly what she is, and that is a Warlpiri Celtic woman. Her book reveals extraordinarily rich upbringing amongst those two cultures, but it was deeply rooted in her Indigenous culture. And that sort of upbringing, she learned the languages, the stories, the culture, and the cultural practices. And many of them were uplifting, many of them were affirming, many of the ones she talks about are quite hilarious. And then there's the dark, the deeply dark and traumatic. And that's the dark side of the culture that she has called out, that tolerates violence and sexual abuse and the male domination of women and children. And it's those deeply corrosive practices that she, like her pioneer activist mother, many of us will recall Bess Price, the former member of the Northern Territory government, they have continuously called out and actually suffered for it. Now, Senator Price has vowed to keep doing so anyway, and should she become minister in a coalition government, she's vowed to have a royal commission into those practices. Now, she also knows those horrors only too well, because she has lost many family members, and she herself has experienced violence, and she describes that in her book, as well as her own experiences of drug and alcohol abuse. And when she talks about that, she's brutally honest. But as I mentioned earlier, she has been shamefully abused by people who should be celebrating her, by fellow Indigenous people who should be calling out that she is an example of the diversity, the rich diversity of Indigenous culture. But unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. And as she says, she survived blackfella politics, she can survive anything. So now, one Indigenous leader said that Senator Price had a dangerous agenda. And Matters of the Heart, this Stoic book, is indeed a memoir, but in it she deftly articulates an agenda to call out abuse and neglect that would, in my view, be dangerous to ignore and perilous to overlook. So, Senator Price, you're very welcome. Thank you.
I'm very grateful for you all being here today. I'm very grateful for the incredible support I have had right around the country in all the efforts of trying to bring a bit of reality to the debate that is Indigenous affairs, but also to drag the truth kicking and screaming into the light and to challenge the status quo and to also attempt to try to bring our wonderful country together again, because I love this country, I love Australia, I love the opportunities, the fact that it's given me so much opportunity in life, and for that, it's been so important and so much a part of my journey. I can tell you now that it's been daunting. It's been a lot different to being able to stand up and speak on an issue than to stand up and speak or write a book about myself, about my life, and about the challenges and the darknesses that I've had to overcome within my life. And it's still daunting, being able to share that so openly. But I'm very grateful for the incredible support and the open hearts of people like yourselves, the Australian people, who have just made it that little bit easier to be able to do that. And I guess I'm living proof of the fact that this country provides opportunity for anybody, that anybody can become what they want in this country, that anybody can make it to the halls of power and be in the driver's seat in terms of putting forward the direction in which this country should be able to go, in a direction that's going to benefit all Australians. And so I guess when I was approached by Sue Smethurst and HarperCollins to embark on a journey of unveiling my life, it was at first a little bit scary, but also I thought, well, it's probably the right time. It's probably the right time because I have had the wonderful opportunity to take the stage, take a national platform on the issues that I'm particularly passionate about. One of the most common questions that has been put to me on social media anyway, at least, is, can you tell me a bit more about yourself? And it's a question I never answer because otherwise I'd be there forever. So I thought, well, now's the opportunity, now's the right time to be able to speak about my life experiences, to be able to shine a light on that so that not only my supporters but my detractors could really understand why I fight for the things that I fight for, why I stand up for the voiceless, why I push back on the status quo. And it all begins, and many of you have probably already read the book. I'm finding that I'm really pleased to find out that many who have bought the book have read it quite quickly. So I'm very humbled about that, to learn that. But many, as you will embark on my journey through my book, Matters of the Heart, many of you will learn about my parents first and my mother's journey. And I really feel as though my mother deserves her own book as well. But her own journey as a Warlpiri woman, a Warlpiri child and girl, and somebody who had to face womanhood at a very young age in becoming a mother at the age of 14. And the struggles she endured and had to overcome, the obligations of customary law placed on her as a 13-year-old, the expectation of her to go and join a polygamous marriage and be married off at such a young age and become a second wife was really not an uncommon practice when my mother was growing up. And it still occurs today. And I guess part of my book also describes my grandfather, who I truly believe, as a Warlpiri lawman who first came in contact with white Australians in his early adolescence, was a revolutionary, forward-thinking man as far as I'm concerned, because he also pushed back on traditional, customary obligations, and he allowed for my mother in the end to make the choices that she wanted to make to better her future, to embark on a journey of understanding this modern Australia that she was now part of, so that it could enrich her life further. And I think I mentioned in the book about being around about the age of 10, and my grandfather, he had lost his sight when I was quite young, so he was blind for the most of the time that I knew him until we lost him. And I remember sitting on his lap as a 10-year-old and him touching my arm and saying to me, "Oh, you must be nearly ready to be married soon." And me going, no, I'm nowhere near it yet. And he chuckled and he said, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry." And he said, "But you know what? When that time comes, I want you to marry a white fella." And my dad was particularly embarrassed by that suggestion. And he said, "Oh, she can marry whoever she wants. It doesn't matter. They don't have to be a white fella. They can be whoever, come from any part of the world." And but what my grandfather meant by that was that he saw in my father an individual who opened the world up for my mother, who took her away from a violent situation where she may have very well lost her life if she'd stayed with, I don't even like to call him my mother's first husband because she was forced into that relationship. But if she hadn't escaped that, then she may very well have never lived, and I may never have come along. So my father to my grandfather symbolised this modern world, and he was so proud that those worlds came together in love, and that my dad was able to be that linchpin toward freedom for my mother. And so that's what my grandfather wanted for me. That's how I saw his comments. That's what he wanted for me. So within the book, I speak about some of the. I guess it's not until you stop and you look back and you reflect on what you've been through in your life, and you think some of these circumstances no one should have to go through. And one of those situations was when I had to. This is quite early in my relationship with my husband, Colin, and we are together as a blended family. It talks about my relationship with my first husband in the book as well. But when Colin came into my life, was a time when I was struggling as an individual, as a single mother, and around that time, very early in the first couple of years we were seeing one another, I was tasked with having to identify my cousin's body in the morgue. And my cousin, who was about 4 years younger than me, had died in an alcohol-fueled car crash where the driver had been punched in the back of the head by her drunk husband in the back seat, which caused the crash that killed my cousin. And Colin very heartwarmingly ensured that he took care of me, that he drove myself and my father, who came on that journey to the morgue, to identify my cousin. And I think, in any relationship, I think that was definitely the point that I realised this bloke is a keeper. I want to marry this bloke, because anybody else might have run in the other direction, but Colin was there right by my side. And he, as well as my stepson Kincaid, who I had the joy of becoming his other mum when he was 4 years old. He's now about to turn 18 this year. But they both have lived the journey and walked the path with myself and my family and my boys. They have been to the many funerals of loved ones that we have lost. To domestic violence and alcohol-fueled violence. Sorry, I didn't think that I would do this, but I'm going to do it. And so when I see Indigenous affairs being weaponised against non-Indigenous Australians, I have to stand up against it, because we're talking about families, we're talking about people, human beings, and those who have walked the walk and been on the path and the journey and seen the heartbreak and lived it. And so why should we be separated by race in our country? The only reason there are those separatists who seek for separatism is because there is an industry that has been built on the backs of the misery of our most marginalised. And it is for them about maintaining their positions of power. It is not about solving the problems of supporting our most marginalised, to empower them to have the lives that in fact they live, to be able to send their kids to school, to be able to earn a six-figure salary, to be able to live a life free of violence in their homes, to be able to own their own home. The same opportunities that is afforded every single Australian in this country. Why should our most marginalised continue to miss out because of their culture or their race? This is Australia and it's 2025. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a Western democracy that should uphold the rights for every citizen equally. And so all those reasons are uncovered in the book, my journey, the reason why I've come this far and why I continue to stand up in the face of some of the most horrific criticisms that I receive especially from supposed Indigenous leaders. If I have to stand up and continue to be a target so that it shines a light on what the problem is in terms of that leadership, then that's what I'll do, so that Australians can see with their very own eyes where our problems lie, why our marginalised cannot get ahead. And part of this book has been about that, because when I talk about some of the horrible things that I've experienced, and one of those things is also being a survivor of domestic violence myself, that experience of going through that, while throughout my life I had witnessed violence within my extended family, I'd never personally really been subjected to it. And so having that experience of being subjected to domestic violence made me absolutely realise that no human being should have to endure that. No human being should have to be treated so appallingly and have to experience the trauma of abuse as I did. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I consider myself one of the lucky ones. And it is then incumbent upon me to be able to fight for those that aren't so lucky as myself. So I think that's why it was so important for me to allow my skeletons to bask in the sunshine, if you like. But I have had the incredible support of my family throughout my life, and that is another reason why I consider myself very lucky, because of the love that I have had in my life to be able to stand up and be that voice for those who are belittled, who are denigrated, who are marginalised, to be that voice, and I'll continue to do so despite the threats. I think it was just this week that I stood, last week of sittings last week, and I stood up to call out the chairperson of the Central Land Council, because not only did I know he had a violent past, because he exists within my extended family, but I had to go through our processes to draw that out for the public to understand. And then from that point, it demonstrated those who would choose to make excuses for that conduct and that behaviour were brought into the light also. And those are the people that I continue to get pushback from, the supposed leadership. But those are the people that the media, the ABC particularly, hold up in high regard and expect the rest of us to revere them. And why should we have this double standard in a country like Australia? We wouldn't allow it anywhere else, but it is allowed in Indigenous affairs for some horrible reason. So I think part of my journey has been trying to change the narrative in this space and to make it take it from a more honest perspective and to prioritise the victims in that regard. and I've done that previously, and much of my work that I've done in my previous week of work as part of the Centre for Independent Studies and onward. It's been really important, and I'm just so grateful and so blessed to have made the impact that I've made, because ultimately, while I might be telling my personal story, it's not about me in the end. It's about ensuring that those who need to have the same opportunities, have freedom of choice, have the basics of an education, to live a life free of violence and sexual abuse, can get that eventually, and for the future. That's what it's ultimately about. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Price. Senator Nampijinpa Price's book, Matters of the Heart, a Memoir, published by HarperCollins, forward by John Howard. We've got copies here tonight and selling them. Some will be sold online. Many of you have already bought them, and you'll be happy to sign them later. So we've got a brief period time for questions and discussion. So just going to lead off on the, thanks for a great talk, just lead off on the political side. So just briefly tell us, you're from the Country Liberal Party in the Northern Territory, which means you sit in the National Party room in Canberra. So just tell us a bit about how you got into politics.
Sure. So I, as part of the Country Liberal Party, the Northern Territory, sit in the Nationals Party room. And in the Territory, we have 2 Senate seats and 2 House of Representatives seats. And so basically I think it was probably during my time working for Imparja Television, and I can say one of my wonderful colleagues is here tonight, so Amy, thank you. During my time working at Imparja Television, I think I had done a lot of touring around the country, and back in the day when I was a children's television presenter and my best friend was a giant honey ant, we sang and danced our way across regional and remote Australia, and it was just such a wonderful time because I had the opportunity to spread messages of, whether it's to do with eradicating trachoma and ensuring that kids are washing their faces, and whether it's taking care of their ears, whether it's an educational message or whatever it might be, but leaving those messages to those kids in those communities. And quite often we'd come to a community where we'd just learned, a couple of weeks before a child had been raped or something horrible like that, or you see these little kids and you just want better for them. And I knew that Warren Snowden had been the member for Lingiari since I was a 5-year-old. I'm pretty sure I was 5 years old. And to me, he'd done nothing. He'd done nothing to improve the lives of my family in remote communities. And given that my mother had previously been a Labor voter and felt ultimately let down by Labor, and felt like a token when she was appointed the chair of the Indigenous Advisory Committee to the Henderson government in the Northern Territory. That's when she made the decision. She made the decision to then run for the Country Liberal Party around that time because of Labor's failure to actually heed the calls of people in remote communities. And watching her go through that process, for me, I thought to myself, you know what, I would love to get rid of Warren Snowden. I would love to take Lingiari off him. And so that was why I decided to have a go in 2019. And prior to that, I'd been elected to Alice Springs Council, and it was the first time actually, because my mother was the Minister for Local Government, that a mother and daughter held those 2 places in government, and had been sworn in by my own mother when I was sworn onto council. So it was a pretty, wonderful historical occasion for us, and the left didn't want to celebrate it. Why would they? But if there would have been a ticker tape parade, put it that way, if we'd both been Labor, but not so because we're Conservative women. And I was unfortunately, I obviously didn't win that seat. Labor have an incredible way of stitching things up, in stitching votes up in remote communities. But after that, I thought I have to, I really, what I want to contribute has to be done at a federal level. And so the opportunity to, well, challenge the sitting senator came up. And with that is when I had the wonderful honour to be elected to the Senate in 2022. So that's how I guess that came about.
Hi, thanks. So what did you find was the most surprising thing for you from the experience that you had in the lead up to the Voice vote? And secondly, what did you learn from that you think you can use going forward if you end up moving to Canberra or having a bigger national profile? Thanks.
What was surprising? I think actually what was surprising was the fact that I at some point I thought Labor and the Yes side were going to pull out a secret weapon. Like I was surprised that there was complete lack of detail for this proposal, and I thought it was a little too easy. And I thought, no, they're going to hit us with something at some point. So that's what I was surprised about, which made our job a lot easier to a degree. But also, I think what I did learn and what I do take away from that is the fact that Australians aren't silly, right? Aussies aren't silly. There might have been a time where, because politically, you've got to be politically correct. We've gone through this woke sort of nonsense, and we're coming out the other end. And many Aussies were very fearful of being, well, traditionally Aussie, just coming out and saying how it is. And so the whole experience, I believe, has ignited that Australian spirit and that idea that, you know what, we should be able to say what we think and what we feel. We should be able to debate things and do it respectfully, and we should be able to do these things without being shouted down, our livelihoods attacked, or, told that we are certain things that the other side like to call us. And I think that is what Australia now wants. We want to get back to who we are, back to basics for the betterment of this country. And I think that is going to resonate going forward with the federal election as well.
Thank you very much for your talk, Senator. Why do you think that this taboo against discussion of violence in remote communities has taken so long?
I think it's largely the concept of being accused of being called racist. For a long time there has been this Aboriginal rights movement, and Aboriginal women, the expectation of Aboriginal women has never been to participate in the whole feminist movement, but do as you're told and take a back seat and just fight for your race as opposed to yourself as an individual, as a woman in your own right. And I think part of that has resonated with the Australian people, because I find the activists that belong to the whole Indigenous rights movement, many can be very aggressive in their own stance. And let's face it, if you're a polite individual, you're reluctant to actually take that on and challenge that. And so speaking out about issues concerning violence is there's such a sort of culture within Indigenous people and their fight for Indigenous rights that suggests that you should not, don't make us look bad, because then, well, the argument is don't make Aboriginal people look bad because it encourages racism. Well, as far as I'm concerned, racism isn't killing our marginalised. It's the violence, it's the alcohol, it's the destruction. And I think part of what I've been trying to do is to say to fellow Australians, no, if you're concerned for your fellow Australian, stand up and talk about it. We're talking about humans here, and that's what we should take it back to, basic human needs. And we should all stand up for one another, regardless of race, regardless of any of those things, regardless of the gaslighting and the bullying from the activist class. But I think that's changing now, and I think Australians are saying, no, you're right, we've got to do this. We've got to stand up as well. And I'll keep saying, I'll push back on the left. Well, especially the feminist class. Well, hang on. Where are the sisters? Where are the sisters to come to the rescue for Indigenous women? I'll call it out for what it is.
Jacinta, I've read your book in about 24 hours. The thing that really struck me it's plainly written, but it's dramatic. And I didn't realise to what extent tribal custom was still ignored by Australian justice. In fact, the women are as bad as the men because there's a cone of silence in the actual areas where these things are happening. And a lot of it is not just drink. It's acknowledged as okay for a man to treat a woman like a chattel, where in our culture probably 1,000 years ago was happening anyway. So how do you break down that cone of silence? Because it's more than the activists here in the cities. It's the actual groups that are having this done to them, and the women too. How do you break through that sort of ignorance about rights?
Well, it comes down to our education institutions as well, who are failing, Australians generally, our children generally. The curriculum pushes a reinvention of Aboriginal culture because academics are largely those who have been removed, Indigenous academics or those who claim to be Indigenous who occupy the academic space don't actually have a clue about traditional culture. And there's a denial going on about traditional culture and how there are still remnants of that playing out now, even amongst, Australians of Indigenous heritage. And we need to get down to the truth of it. People like Bruce Pascoe do us no favours at all because he completely reinvents culture, which is a deep insult, in fact, to traditional culture and the wonderful aspects of traditional culture, if you like. But we've got to be more honest. And I had the wonderful privilege of addressing a judges' conference a couple of weeks back. So judges from around the country came together and I had the wonderful opportunity to speak exactly about these issues and customary law and how it impacts, our victims. Justice Judith Kelly is doing a remarkable job in the Northern Territory. She is one of the few justices that are actually speaking honestly about what's going on the ground. And I was quite happy to back her up in that space, but we need more. And we need those in the justice system to understand the truth of what's going on instead of these rose-coloured glasses which have this social justice sort of tint over them about how that claim that the structures are racist when in fact, no, they're set up for all Australians equally. Yes, Indigenous Australians are disproportionately affected, but why is that? Because we've got disproportionately affected by sexual abuse in our communities and DV. And if we don't fix those problems, which requires taking responsibility, then we won't reduce the rates of incarceration in our country. So it's all about looking at the whole picture and not just cherry picking parts and continuing to say, if you blanket it with colonisation, everyone's responsible, but nobody's responsible in the end.
Yeah. Jacinta, I know it's difficult to generalise, but I see a vast difference between coalition women, MPs and politicians and the Labor. And I see you as being the standard bearer in terms of strength and steeliness and heart, whereas I see them as being far more mediocre and ineffective. Would you like to comment?
I'd agree with that.
I think we've got one speaker tonight will be good enough. Okay, here we go. Here.
I guess on our side of politics, we can be individuals in our own right. We can debate. We can debate one another respectfully. We can debate one another respectfully. But on the Labor side, you have to toe the party line, right? You've got to toe the party line, even if you don't believe it. But at the same time, I look at people. Well, I've known Mullenderry for years. Our fathers worked together, and I look and I think, why do you deny the truth in what you're doing? Why are you doing that? Because it must be eating away at her at the same time. So, but I don't understand it.
Jacinta, thank you. You're very courageous. I would celebrate that. A couple of years ago, you did a press talk where, shock horror, you refused to acknowledge that colonialism was a big part to blame for the state of Indigenous Australians today. Would you like to talk a little bit about that now, please?
Sure. Well, I guess the question that was put to me was, do I feel there's still negative effects of colonisation now? I've never denied that colonisation has had an impact. It certainly has, and that question was the Guardian trying to wedge me and get their aha moment. They hadn't obviously heard a single thing I'd said throughout my whole talk, but it's this focus on blaming colonisation and linking that to white people in this country, and then therefore it's white Australia's fault for what's happened. When, hang on a second, my great-great-great-grandmother was brought here as an orphan following losing her parents during the potato famine. How is she responsible for what happened in this country? The man she married, my great-great-great-grandfather, was dispossessed of his own land as a 14-year-old farmhand who had broken enter and therefore had to serve a 40-year sentence over in a completely different country. I could not imagine my 14-year-old son being taken to a completely different country and told to serve a 40-year sentence. So we got to realise that we're not the only ones who have experienced trauma. It's the human experience, full stop. I mean, we're now looking at incredible rates of anti-Semitism in this country from the most persecuted people on the face of the earth, and yet we still, Indigenous Australians who are doing relatively well for themselves still want to complain about their situation, yet ignore those in remote communities living under customary law, subjected to customary law, and at the same time are benefiting from colonisation. When they say, oh, but you've benefited from colonisation, we all have. Let's face it, we all have benefited, right? Because I certainly wouldn't want to be running around with a hairstring belt on, being married off to a man 50 years older than me, where there are several other wives involved, and having to live off the land. Let's face it, I do not want to live that life. My ancestors lived it, and that's wonderful. But I certainly don't believe that anyone wants to live that life now. And what we fail to do is recognise our privilege in this country, and that we should be grateful for that, and we should not pass our dislike on to the next generation. We should be empowering them and teaching them they're capable Australians that have all the opportunities at their fingertips if they choose to want to go forward with that.
Excuse me. Are you happy to go? You happy to go for a bit longer? I'm doing very well. Okay, we're going to go till the top of the hour. But we don't have a lot of time. Everyone's got to be brief. So whoever's got the microphone.
Sorry, I'll try to be brief. Okay, I normally wouldn't ask a question, but you've touched on some topics of particular interest to me, and I have to, if I could introduce the questions by saying I was formerly the Chief Justice of the Family Court, and during the Howard years, I was the chair of Centrelink, and during that time, I spent quite a bit of time in Indigenous communities such as Maningrida. And I want to ask a couple of questions that are intertwined. Firstly, on the first occasion I went to Maningrida, there had been a very good program keeping men employed. 3 years after it was implemented, working very well, someone in Canberra decided to cut it off. As a result, I was speaking to a nurse who was a very large lady, but she was truly black and blue. And she had been beaten up by her husband. And I said to her, why have you put up with this? And she said, his life is so bad now that he has no job, nothing to do but drink. He beats me up. And the problem of family violence with women just accepting that they'll be beaten up is not a problem in the Indigenous community, it's in the white community as well. So my And I had a woman in court once. I want to ask, what can we do to get women to accept that violence against them is simply unacceptable?
Certainly. Well, it goes to what I've been trying to talk about, in traditional culture, we accept violence. We were, any small-scale society on earth operated in that way, where they were in the defence force, legal system, use violence as a means of social control. And, of course, women, under customary law, it's okay for women to be subjected to violence if the husband feels, it's his right to, if he feels like his wife's not behaving like a wife should, then he can subject her to violence. So it's about having those hard conversations and challenging Indigenous Australians, which is what I've been doing and then called a sellout for doing so, to say, we accept violence in traditional culture. It is a fact. So we need to reflect on that and say, how about we let go of that and not accept violence anymore? And women, it's almost like Stockholm syndrome for a lot of Aboriginal women, because they genuinely believe that men are more important. And, for example, if I were to walk on sacred men's ceremonial ground, the law, customary law, says that I can be beaten, possibly gang raped, and even killed, depending on, how significant that ceremonial place is. And women will accept that, okay, that woman did that, she did the wrong thing, she deserves to be punished. So women, it's ingrained in women as well, and that is part of the problem. It takes education, it takes reflection, it takes enlightenment and an understanding of your own culture in a way to be able to stand back and reflect on it and say, hang on a second, these are not working for us anymore. Our young men go through a very traumatic initiation process, which I won't go into great detail, because even as a woman, if I mention that, I can be punished physically for talking about that. But if we didn't send our boys to go through that, I believe we would have young men who are much more together than what they currently are. And it is my belief, and I've shared with my close family male members who agree with me privately, why don't we just let our boys have an education and then decide for themselves if they want to go through that process? These are the things that we need to reflect on and reform. It's positive cultural reform that needs to take place, but that can only happen when Indigenous Australians, we stop telling them they're victims without any agency and allow them to have the freedom of responsibility. That's what's got to change. And that's what's wrong with the separatist approach, and that's what's wrong with what the activists have gone and done, because they don't live under customary law. They're not subjected to that. But we all know that there's many also that have in their own backyards a great deal of problems that they're not prepared to encounter.
Does the NLP have a roadmap for deinstitutionalising the remote communities, of mainstreaming them? Because this seems to me the only way to go.
Yeah, look, under my responsibilities as Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, I have some plans about how we start to treat remote communities, particularly where our most marginalised are. And in the Northern Territory, it starts with reforming the Land Rights Act, which means that I'm a traditional owner under the Land Rights Act, and so our land is communally owned. Any determinations that we want to make about our land has to be done with consulting everybody, pretty much. So not just those within our family group, but affected persons, if you like. So now we've got green lawfare that comes and interferes with Aboriginal people's land. So what we need to do is create an environment where we can allow for economic development on country that would otherwise be unavailable to traditional owners. I mean, traditional owners can apply for a lease to lease their own land through the land councils, but it never occurs. And what we want is to allow for traditional owners to be wealth generators in their own right and job creators in their own right, like other Australians get the opportunity to right around this country. That's what we need to do, which will remove which gets us away from welfare dependency, because it's ultimately welfare dependency that keeps Indigenous people in such a miserable cycle. And that is something that I think former governments, even on our side of politics, have been too scared to reform. Certainly Labor don't want to, because Labor, if they keep Indigenous Australians marginalised, they control them, they get the vote. So they want to be seen as the ones that are always, I'm going to give you this amount of money, or, you get your royalties through this way. There's way better ways to do it, and I've got plans for an overhaul. That's why we need to win this next federal election.
We've run out of time, so this is the last question. It's come in from one of our Zoom people who says, if you came back here in a couple of years, and she adds, if there's a new addition to your book, what do you think you'd be able to tell us that's different from what would you hope to be able to tell us that's different from what you said tonight? Just very briefly.
Well, what I'd hope to see is that we're actually, the plan is to actually highlight, to focus, hone in on who our marginalised are, and stop taking a blanket approach that suggests that all Indigenous Australians are disadvantaged for no other reason but racial heritage, and to ensure that those in remote communities are getting an education, a satisfactory education, and treating them like ESL learners like we do with our migrant community. Because why wouldn't we? We're talking about young kids whose first language is not English. So it's about getting back to basics, and I'd hope to be able to see more young people from communities whose first language is not English finishing school, going to university, or going into meaningful employment and having much more opportunity. That's what I hope to see, that our marginalised are actually better accessing the opportunities that exist in this country, and that we've created an environment to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. So a lot of people here tonight, and I said I'd be very brief, and I will be. Terrific performance, well done. Copies of the book, Jacinta Nampijinpa Prize, a memoir, forward by John Howard, HarperCollins publisher. Well done, and you'll have you back sometime. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerard.